Let's go. Richard. Good morning. I'm glad y'all all got here, whoever did get here. I'm going to ask Mr. Ramsey if he'll open us in prayer.
Please bow your heads. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this opportunity to come together and work as a group and as leaders of this state to do things that honor and are pleasing to you. And please, on this morning when we've got weather concerns out there, watch over our citizens as they drive around Metro Atlanta and try to get through this weather safely. Please give us the wisdom, guidance, and discernment to do things that are pleasing to you and that honor your name. In our Lord and Savior's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Okay. We're going to go through them fairly quickly. I'm going to let Mr. Yates is first.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, committee. Good to be with you today. I have House Bill 123, and after the subcommittee, it ended up as LC 390939S. And the Legislative Council cut it down and proposed this short half-page version to take the place of the original bill. And I'll tell you how I got into the original bill. Mrs. Fletcher came to me and said that she lost her daughter in an accident caused by a breakaway trailer that broke away from the towing vehicle. And since I had a experience when I was working at Ford Motor Company in Colorado, I knew there was a better way. I had a camper trailer, used to take it across the Continental Divide at 12,100 feet, and they required a chain to restrain the trailer from leaving the vehicle. So this is the reason I decided to put it in. It looked like a very reasonable request, and so I'm asking favorable consideration for the version that Legislative Council came up with to restrain the trailer from the towing vehicle.
Any questions of Mr. Yates? Mr. Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Yates, the definition of trailer as defined in paragraph 68 of Code Section 40-1, what is that definition there? My question is, are we talking, is that only with a ball, or does it actually include bullpens, those types of trailers as well?
Well, all the trailers I've seen have a ball, but as I say, the law in Colorado required a restraining chain in case some jolt in the road caused the ball to cut loose.
And I'm okay with that. What I'm concerned about is if it gets into where every single peanut wagon or anything that's out there that they use in hauling products to is just used with a pull pin and not with a ball, are we getting into where we're requiring them to be used in a chain? Now I'm okay with the bill. I was just wondering with that definition.
Well, somebody brought up a question of whether it would hurt people in agriculture, and I said, well, if you're in agriculture, I would think you ought to restrain your trailer regardless of what you're doing with it. But I know what you're talking about. That's a different type of attachment there. But this is what Legislative Council came up with.
Okay, thank you.
The only thing, as I say, based on my experience in Colorado, I just think it should be restrained so that it don't kill anybody.
Thank you, Mr. Yates. What's that? That's Mr. Yates. Thank you. You're good.
You're through. Thank you. Ask your favorable consideration.
Mr. Kidd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I came here to ask you for a little hip-hop bill, that old-timey days. We hop in and hop out real quick. House Bill 82, but I don't think it was on your list. But if it's not on your list, I'll come back another day.
Is it on the yellow sheet?
All it does was
Okay.
all the bill does is state that the president of Georgia Military College or his designee could serve on the Greenway Authority, and the president of Georgia College and State University or their designee could serve on the Greenway Authority there in Millersville, Baldwin County. Pretty simple bill. And as long as I'm here, Mr. Chairman, House Bill 85 has been asked for. It's relative to alcohol being served on the campus of Central State Hospital. The preamble reads kind of bad, but it was written originally when there were 12,500 patients down there. Now there are only 14. And we're trying to, Brett Harrell, we're trying to redevelop the property down there, and so people can have hospitality functions on Central State property down there.
All right.
Thank you, Mr.
No more questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Broderick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Under modified structure on the second page, I'm here to ask for HB 211. This is the housekeeping bill, drug update bill that we do each year. And getting sort of late, got to get it across the way and through their process, through their weeds. And I hope we can get it moving and get it out. Appreciate your favorable considerations. If there's any questions, I'll be glad to answer those.
Any questions? No questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Lumsden.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I come before you to ask for your favorable consideration for House Bill 99. That appears under modified open rule, page 1, item 3. This makes tenancy in common a default condition in certain divorce situations. Also, modified open rule, item 12, House Bill 338, which is a funding mechanism for electronic citation systems. I would also request that you permit that bill to go forward. I stand for any questions.
Any questions, Mr. Lumsden, on either bill? No questions. Mr. Bruce.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm back to ask for House Bill 89 under modified open rules, second item. Basically, all it does is help to declare an area to be a drug-free zone to crack down on prostitution and drug trafficking in the area. Yesterday, Mr. Chairman, after the committee meeting, several of your members came and asked whether this would apply across the state, and the answer to that is yes, it would, for all of those areas that have been designated by their local county or city as a drug-free zone. It changes the date to include everybody in there.
Any questions, Mr. Bruce? Why is it? Yeah, we do.
There was a question you want me to say for it?
Yeah, it's for him.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Bruce, what does this mean? Does this mean that a community just puts up a sign that says drug-free zone? What does it actually do?
It puts up, it allows them to put up the signs to say that, but it also allows for stronger penalties for people who are involved in the trafficking of drugs.
So stronger penalties, heavier fines, is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay.
It goes after those that are actually selling the drugs as opposed to those that are using them.
Okay. Isn't it true we already are we not doing that now?
Yeah, we do it, but it's only, there's a date that has to be changed to include areas that were designated as drug-free zones by the local governments. So it changes the date to include those that came after the last date.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
No more questions. Mr. Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I come before you once again to bring forth HB 115. Will simply, it's under modified open rule, I should add, which will simply allow consumer to be able to avoid foreclosure in certain situations. By your support of this bill, you will most certainly prevent some consumers from losing their home. I might add that it was well vetted by the Judiciary Committee. This is a bill that has passed this committee and the House previously. I ask for your favorable consideration.
No questions. Ms. Beskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm here today for two bills. First, again, on House Bill 297 under open rule, the first bill under open rule. This bill would empower state licensing boards to contract with a National Association of State Boards to receive applications for examinations and to perform administrative services with respect to such applications. I'm also here today for House Bill 207 under modified open rule, halfway down. This bill relates to judicial disqualification and provides for the disqualification to serve of judges, judicial officers, trial jurors, and grand jurors in the case of relationship within the third degree of consanguinity to a party at interest in the matter. So I would ask for your favorable consideration on these two bills.
Anybody got any questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee.
Mr. Jacobs, I didn't see you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually have four bills on the calendar now. First up is House Bill 197. House Bill 197 updates three existing uniform laws that we have already on the books in the debtor-creditor area of the law. One of them is Article 1 of the UCC, one is the Foreign Country Money Judgments Recognition Act, and the other is the Uniform Fraudulent Transfers Act. Again, all of it, there are a lot of pages in the bill, but all the bill does is brings Georgia into line with the most up-to-date version of these particular uniform laws. And that's House Bill 197.
Tell you what, since you've got four, let's ask, anybody got any questions on that one? Next one.
All right, next one is House Bill 213. House Bill 213 does two things. First, it does contain a permanent lift of the 50-50 split for MARTA that is contingent upon MARTA performing a management audit every 4 years. Provided that they do perform that management audit every 4 years, the 50-50 split would remain lifted. But if they ever fail to do that, then it would go back into place for the ensuing 4 years. The other thing that the bill does is extends out the existence of the penny sales tax, which would automatically go back to a half penny in the year 2047. The reason that we are doing this is to enable MARTA to do 30-year bonds. If we do not extend this out another 10 years, then they won't be able to do 30-year bonds beginning in the year 2017.
Mr. Earhart.
Representative Jacobs, Chairman Jacobs. With respect to the 50-50 split, I seem to remember, isn't it true, that when we talked about placing this the last time, this was going to be something that was temporary? Is that not true?
There is a current lift that ran for 3 years that we're in the first year of, so it's got 2 years to go.
Okay, so all they have to do is perform a management audit. Are there any standards to that audit? Are there any consequences if the audit doesn't? But if the way you characterize it, I haven't had a chance to get deep into it. So the only standard to continue to keep the 50/50 is performing the audit?
Well, the management audit is provided for in the MARTA Act, and it has to be done under the direction of the MARTA Oversight Committee, which is my committee.
That's correct, but what if the audit shows something different and we've given them a permanent? Wouldn't it be better to continue to have them come back and take a look each time so that we can keep a handle on that?
Well,
put a sunset on
it. The genesis of the issue with the audit is that the current, in 2012, MARTA performed a management audit under KPMG. We have used that audit to kind of hold MARTA's feet to the fire, so to speak, and with clear benchmarks as to some privatization recommendations that they need to be implementing. They are right on schedule with that, and it has been a very helpful tool for my committee to make sure that MARTA is operating as efficiently as possible. They are back in the black, and in terms of cash in, cash out. And as far as I'm concerned, this is a perfectly fine way to handle this, as long as we do have a management audit performed every 4 years under my committee's direction.
Ms. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for bringing us this bill. I think, like Representative Earhart, I've served on the State Planning and Community Affairs Committee for several years, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and there was a constant struggle with maintenance and operations and capital investments. And the fear at that time was that if we turn loose a percentage, then the money is going to go directly to maintenance and operations, and there'll be no capital investments. So that's why it was there, and that's why I still think it's critical. I'm glad you're doing your audit, but I think one realizes that this has not always been a smoothly operated authority.
Well, I'll acknowledge that, first of all, and second of all, this was a recommendation that was in the Joint Transportation Task Force recommendations. There is a reason that it is in a separate bill from other MARTA propositions that are in House Bill 214. But the other thing I'll say about the 50-50 split is that the reality of MARTA's use of sales tax proceeds now is that they are very close to that 50% limit on debt service alone. And of course, debt service is capital. So the 50-50, although even though it does serve a purpose, and I agree with that, the reality of it is that 50% of MARTA's sales tax proceeds are used for capital and are constrained for that anyways by virtue of their debt service alone.
Mr. Weldon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Jacobs, purpose of this, as I understand your explanation of the bill, the main purpose is to allow MARTA to get 30-year bonds. Is that?
Well, that's one of the propositions in the bill, but to be clear, the bill does contain a permanent lift of the 50-50 split, which I would say is the more significant of the two propositions.
And the lift of that 50-50 split would, if you were able to, if MARTA were able to reconfigure its financing, that would be beneficial not only to MARTA but to everybody involved, all the taxpayers involved, so they could reduce their long-term obligations.
Well, right. I mean, they would not be able to do 30-year bonds if we don't extend out the penny, the full percent for some period of time. Because as of 2017, they go back to a half penny and they can't do 30-year bonds on that extra half penny.
Thank
you. Next bill.
The next bill is House Bill 214. This bill has a number of items in it that were in MARTA's legislative agenda. One of them is Clayton County just joined the system. They're entitled to 2 board appointments. Last year, we staggered the terms of the existing board members, but the MARTA Act does not provide for these 2 new board members to be staggered. It does that. It makes it easier for MARTA to take creative proposals with regard to providing concessions at MARTA stations. It has some procedures that are clearer than what we passed last year for the adjudication of suspensions and fines. It does tighten up for use of the MARTA system when there are infractions. It does have some tightening up of the management audit language. And then finally, when a new jurisdiction joins MARTA, they would have to come in at the full penny rather than the half penny option that is presently contained in the MARTA Act. There was a lot of wrangling over that issue with Clayton County that frankly was unnecessary, and so the decision, at least in the bill, is to have everyone participate in MARTA under the same terms.
Questions? No questions. Next.
And then, of course, there's House Bill 215, Mr. Chairman, which is the host bill.
Anybody want a question on 215? No questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Williamson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm here today to ask for House Bill 184. So on your back page, about fourth from the top under modified structure. This is the annual housekeeping bill for the Department of Banking and Finance. It comes with the full support of the regulated industries involved, the governor's office, and the full support of our Commissioner of Banking and Finance, Mr. Kevin Hagler, who's been on the job about 18 months now. Be happy to answer any questions.
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you, and I ask for your favorable consideration.
Senator Kurt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here to ask for your favorable consideration of Senate Bill 53. The urgency of this is, I'm not just a young freshman senator here trying to hurry things along. This extends a sunset clause on Senate Bill 65 that passed last year. That sunset clause ends March 15th of this year. We have to have this signed into law by the governor by March 15th, and so that's the urgency for this. If we fail to do that, Department of Behavioral Health, I've talked to Commissioner Berry, they had trouble staffing their crisis units, crisis stabilization units. We have 24 of those around the state. Those were part of the DOJ settlement that took some of the pressure off the ERs and off the sheriff's departments and waiting with people with mental health. And they had trouble staffing those until this law passed last year. So we'll have a gap in that if they have to stop work March 15th because we don't get this done. So please, I ask your favorable consideration, and I'm open for any questions.
Mr. Ramsey.
Did the bill change any in House committee?
No.
Okay, so we're procedurally we're real close.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
No other questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Benton, well, he's not here. There he is. You've moved.
Yeah. Trying to move the mustache row to the second row too, see. Mr. Chairman, House Bill 51, this was a bill that passed out of the House last year and got caught up in the Senate. Has to do with redemption of property and the payment of HOA dues during that period of time. Appreciate your consideration.
Questions? Mr. Benton,
Yes, sir.
when we, payment of dues, go through to this committee and tell me what that does exactly to that house or whatever that's been foreclosed on and then redeemed.
It can be a house or it can be a vacant lot. And these are properties that are sold on the courthouse step. And for 1 year, the person that had the property foreclosed on has a chance to redeem that property. But during that same year, under Georgia law, the homeowners association can assess the dues to the person who has purchased that property. Now, that's okay if the property doesn't get redeemed, but if it does, he is still on the hook for the homeowners association dues, and the bank or whoever it is that redeemed the property has gotten a year of not having to pay the homeowners association dues, and this bill would correct that problem.
In other words, they don't get double for those months that the new owner had paid the homeowner's dues.
No,
Are they going to get doubled?
No, they get 20. They get their money plus 20% in the bill. Now they don't get anything. They've just been assessed those dues, and the courts have ruled that they have to pay them, or the HOAs can take them to court, and the courts are having to rule on the side of the HOAs. Was that clear enough, or do I?
No, no, we'll talk.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
We'll talk.
Okay.
Mr. Weldon.
Chairman, I'd respectfully request consideration of House Bill 212 on the first page under modified open rule. And this bill, all it does is just makes provision to allow CRNAs to continue to practice as they have to the passage of the Pain Management Clinic Act. And then on the back page, House Bill 154, magistrate courts. This just brings magistrate and probate courts into line with each other regarding the amount that a court can charge for a fine on the issue of contempt, which is a total and a maximum of $500.
Any questions? Any question? Wait a second. Do have a question. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On 212, for clarification, please. At the present time, you don't have to be on site, a healthcare professional does not have to be on site to provide medical treatment or services. I'm missing something here.
This bill, House Bill 212, is not a modification of the Pain Management Clinic Act. This is a clarification of the issue regarding certified registered nurse practitioners, that they can continue to conduct the services that they provide pursuant to a doctor's order, just like they had before. What we're doing, it's not a change in the law, it's a clarification, because there was some discussion about that if people were working for CRNA. That's all it is. It doesn't change the law in this bill, it just clarifies.
Any other questions? Mr. Willard.
Mr. Chairman, I asked for House Bill 59, which we've had previously presented. This is the bill that corrects what was a decision of our state Supreme Court recognizing that sovereign immunity to be granted to, or to be removed as far as allowing individuals who seek to have redress against the state for wrongful acts can do so. Currently, with that court decision, that's been removed, and really the citizens of our state that we represent do not have that ability.
Any questions? Mr. Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 2, under modified structure, House Bill 194 deals with advanced voting times.
Ms. Abrams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to request HB 89, which simply allows for the continuation of drug-free commercial zones.
Ms. Hughley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to bring to your attention House Bill 115, the Foreclosure Cure Act of Mr. Mitchell.
Mr. Smyrie.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'd like to add my name to a House Bill on the front page, House Bill 213. That's an issue we discussed during our transportation hearings. I'd like to put my name by it. Thank you.
Mr. A. Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I asked for House Bill 192. At the discussion on Friday, there was need to do an amendment, and you'll see a Rules Committee amendment for that. It basically set forth the parameters about when that employee is agreeing, they'll have to sign an agreement with the county so they can use that P card or that credit card. You know, quite frankly, this is about stopping up some of the loopholes and saying there's a code of conduct. If you're a local elected official, quit using P cards and credit cards to basically run your expense account. Let's get them in touch with the real world, since they splatter all of us when they pull such behavior as what we've seen in the press.
You have on our desk an amendment, AM 281385. Would you like to go through it and ask for it?
Yes, sir. This was just an amendment that was suggested by the minority member of the Powell caucus and the minority leader, Ms. Abrams, as a way of fixing that language. It just basically says that before being issued a government purchasing card, the user shall sign and accept the agreement with the county, local school system, or consolidated government, or the municipal corporation that they'll adhere to those rules and regulations.
Anybody got a question on the amendment? Well, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and vote on the amendment, so when we put it on the floor, it's already included. Do I hear a motion, Mr. Powell? Any opposed to adding AM 281385 to the desk as the amendment? That amendment will be a rules amendment that will go on the desk for the body to vote on when this bill gets on the floor. Mr. Stevens.
Mr. Chairman, asking for House Bill 211.
Where's our little bill about giving everybody a Sunday? Is it right? Whose committee is that in? The bill that gives everybody one Sunday a year that they can bypass coming down here and making a law so I can have St. Patrick's Day.
Oh, that's...
Whose bill is that? It's Harold's bill.
It's being massaged.
Okay. Okay. Don't want to be much mean, but let's go back to Mr. Peake. I've asked Mr. Peake to go ahead. His bill got out last night, and I've asked him to tell us a little bit about what happened in the bill, so when we see it show up tomorrow, you'll know that it's alive and well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize if the bill is not in front of you. It will be online later today if you want to look at it. But basically, HB1, the medical cannabis bill, passed out of Judy non-civil yesterday. basically does two things. It allows immunity for possession of cannabis oil with a maximum amount of 5% THC for 8 qualifying conditions, which would be cancer, MS, seizure disorders, ALS, Crohn's disease, Parkinson's disease, mitochondrial disease, fibromyalgia, and only for those who have obtained a registration card from the Department of Public Health upon a recommendation from a physician. It keeps the doctor and patient relationship at the core of the decision of whether a patient should have access to cannabis oil. We also addressed some concerns that law enforcement had. We've put a maximum amount that can be in possession of 20 ounces. Anything above that would be considered a felony. The second part that does, it creates the Georgia Commission on Medical Cannabis, which will have a specific charge to make a recommendation to the governor and the General Assembly by December of 2015 of what is the best regulatory infrastructure for an in-state growth model of medical cannabis for Georgia. And this commission will be made up of medical professionals, folks from the Department of Ag, law enforcement, pharmacists, and a handful of others. So that's basically what the bill does, Mr. Chairman. Be more than glad to answer some questions if there are some.
Ms. Abrams' question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Peake, can you speak to the concerns about the inclusion of sickle cell anemia, given the inclusion of other rare diseases such as Crohn's disease?
Yeah, we did. What we tried to do was take a look at the 23 other states that have medical cannabis legislation and find out which ones are consistently in each one of those states. What diagnoses are consistently in each one of those other states? And that's how we came up with this list of 8. All of these are consistently in those other states. We did not see sickle cell anemia on a single list of any of the other 23 states that had medical cannabis legislation.
For one further question, would you object to the inclusion, given the fact that in the 23 other states, since sickle cell anemia predominantly affects people of color, and the 23 states that currently have these laws do not have substantial populations of color, was there a consideration that the correlation between the listing of those diseases may be related to the stage of the population?
We did not look at that, Representative Abrams. I mean, we looked at it strictly from what was consistent in those states. We had this debate in the committee a good bit yesterday, and we limited it to these diagnoses because that was the consensus of what, as we all know we do in any type of legislation, what can get passed by each chamber and what can ultimately get the signature of the governor. And that's why we limited it to these list of diagnoses.
Thank you.
Mr. Rice.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Peake, I think I noticed that there was an increase from 0.3 to 0.5.
That's correct.
In the active ingredient. Can you tell me the rationale for that?
We sure did. We had a good bit of debate about that in the committee as well, too. The 3% THC level is consistent with what's done in other states. We took the level to 5% because we have 17 medical refugees who have moved to another state, of which I've had conversations with each one of them, and most of them consistently only needed a THC level of 1 to 2%. There were several, though, that were, for instance, a 20-year-old young woman who is not a young child who needed a higher level of THC, between 4 and 5%, was seeing significant impact. Positive impact from that, and so we made the decision based on evidence that we'd received back from folks who have been in the real world, if you will, of taking medical cannabis, and that's why we made the decision to move to 5%. We also, Virginia last week passed legislation also very similar to this that increased or set a maximum amount of 5% THC as well too. So that was the rationale. We felt like we wanted to, as long as we're keeping it between the relationship between the medical professional and the patient, why, quite frankly, why would we limit it at all if the decision is going to be left between the physician and the patient? But we felt like in an abundance of caution that we wanted to make sure we had some maximum put on there, and that's why we decided the 5%.
Mr. Setzler.
Chairman, members of the committee, there was some discussion. Representative Peake was friendly to some of it. there is going to be an amendment that comes from the committee that's going to be offered through rules tomorrow to be offered on the floor. I presume that's still the case, Representative Peake?
That if you're referring to the amendment that the hospitals groups have requested, yes. We're still working on some of the language. The purpose of the intent for the committee is to make sure that we don't have a situation where a patient, a parent, takes their child to CHOA and because the hospital is concerned about potential liability, turns away the patient at the hospital because they have possession of cannabis oil. And so that's the purpose of the amendment. We're working on that with the Hospital Association and CHOA as well as trial lawyers to make sure that they're comfortable with that as well too. And we should have that amendment for you by tomorrow, Mr. Chairman, I believe, if it's the will of the committee to accept it.
Mr. Chairman, I would also offer to the committee, there was some discussion in committee yesterday, and I would just offer it for consideration. I intend to offer an amendment through the same process through this committee, that because we're talking about, I think there's concerns were raised about the THC levels. I would suggest that the CBD, THC oil would be monitored through the prescription drug monitoring database that we use for other prescription drugs. We're talking about a Schedule I substance at the federal level. It would seem consistent to the protections we've put on other drugs that we have prescribed routinely.
Mr. Chairman, if I could address that real quick. I did have some conversations with Representative Seltzer about that. I did have further conversations with Legislative Counsel afterwards, and because there's not a prescription that is going to be offered for access to this product, that would be problematic to go down that path, and that's based on the recommendation from Legislative Counsel. So it doesn't appear that that's really an option, and I'm not sure I'd be supportive of that amendment as well too.
We'll discuss those amendments at the proper time. Mr. Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Peake, regarding the limitations, the 5% limitation and so forth, in a practical sense, a parent that may obtain this for their child in another state and now can lawfully have it and possess it in Georgia, will they know what the percentage is, or are we opening up a case where there's going to be perpetual probable cause to have every one of these samples seized to see what if it's 5.11%? What happens in that?
That's a fair question, and I'm sorry I didn't bring the little vial. That each vial that will be given to a patient, to a citizen, will be required to have a labeling on it showing what the THC level is on that particular product. The amount of CBD in it as well as the amount of THC, and also we're required to have a lab test of showing what the components are of that particular product. So that satisfied law enforcement as well as some of the other things we did, that they would be able to take the vial. Sure, if they had probable cause to think that maybe the product that was in there was not below the limit, they would have the ability to take the product and go test it at the Georgia Crime Lab. But that's the one defense that would be provided to the citizen, is that we'll have the THC percentage on the vial, on a label.
Mr. Weldon.
Representative Peake, could you just tell us about any double-blind scientific studies that have made findings that THC provides a bona fide medical benefit to patients?
They're very limited, Representative Chairman Weldon, at this point, because marijuana is a Schedule I narcotic drug. There's very little research done on it. And so there is a clinical trial that's going on right now at GRU, funded by our state, us, that is testing a product that is pure CBD with no THC in it whatsoever. And that test is ongoing. But to answer your question, there are none, and that's been problematic. And until there are changes at the federal level, quite frankly, removing it from a Schedule I narcotic, it's going to be difficult to get that research done.
If I could follow up, Mr. Chairman. Representative Peake, isn't it true that the CBD is the only compound that is derived from marijuana that is alleged and asserted that with only anecdotal evidence to benefit children that have these seizures and types of disorders.
That is correct, that the CBD is the therapeutic part of the plant that is seen to have such positive impact, particularly for children with seizure disorders. The anecdotal evidence that we're receiving from the hundreds of people who have been out in another state to obtain it, though, is that there is a need for a level of THC in the product to make it effective for the reduction of this seizure activity.
That's enough. I'm done.
Thank you.
That's enough. We will have other opportunities, but I just wanted to kind of get a start. Also on your desk you have an amendment to HB 85. Mr. Roberts from the 155th put this on your desk, AM 360490. Mr. Roberts.
Mr. Chairman, this is just the language on the amendment that I described the other day. It actually has to do with a local issue for us in one of our communities, even though it is not specific to just that one location. But it's dealing with a certain grocery store that wants to come in and open up, and we've got an issue where we've got a school administrative building that's bordering this property. Across the street, we've got a golf course that's owned by a college, and there's also another administrative building that's across that street as well. So this is to allow for them to come in and put that grocery store there, allow them to sell beer and wine. Bottom line is, if they don't have this ability, they're not going to choose to come there and go somewhere else. And it's about 200 jobs it's going to create for us.
Anyone got a question of Mr. Roberts on his amendment? Same thing on this amendment. This is an amendment that will go on the floor from rules for the House to vote on. I need a motion to approve the amendment.
So moved.
Is there any objection? So this will be on the floor when 85 is on the floor. Mr. Roberts, you wanted to say anything about 170?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, sir, I request that we move House Bill 170 back to the full committee to make some changes. As the committee knows, we do not like to do subs in Rules Committee, so we're going to take it back and make a couple changes, and we'll have it back before you in the next day or two.
Thank you. All right. We're going to set it for Wednesday, the 22nd legislative day. Under modified structure, HB 59. Any opposition? Under modified structure, HB 85 with the amendment. Any opposition? It's on. Under modified structure, HB 211. Any opposition? It's on. Under modified structure, HB 261. Any opposition? We had a couple of others that could have gone on, but since they didn't show up, they don't want them. That's it.